August 3rd, 1980, Unsolved Township, Michigan. 20-year-old Sharita Thomas borrows her friend's car to pick up her daughter from a babysitter, but the vehicle breaks down before she arrives. Witnesses see Sharita climb into a blue pickup truck driven by a white male, but she's never heard from again. Jimmy Allen Nelson, the babysitter's brother-in-law, is suspected of harming Sharita in a racially motivated hate crime. And even though Sharita's body is not found, Nelson is convicted of her murder 3 decades later. However, Nelson's conviction is overturned when new evidence surfaces which reportedly implicates another suspect. But no one is charged with the crime, and Sharita remains a missing person. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a pretty convoluted missing persons case to cover today, the 1980 disappearance of Sharita Thomas. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Chris Wimmer, the host of an historical true crime podcast called Infamous America. The Trail Went Cold is currently doing some cross-promotion with Infamous America, and I will be telling you more about that show later in this episode. Anyway, as you probably know, due to the events which are taking place in the world right now, every episode of The Trail Went Cold we're releasing over the course of this month is featuring an unsolved cold case in which the victims were persons of color. Today's victim is a 20-year-old African-American woman who went missing nearly 40 years ago, and one theory is that her disappearance may have been a racially motivated hate crime. In fact, a suspect named Jimmy Allen Nelson, who had a reputation for being a violent racist, wound up being charged and convicted of Sharita's murder, even though her body has never been found. However, Nelson's conviction would be overturned after new evidence surfaced which allegedly pointed towards another suspect, though specific details about this have been sealed and kept from the public. There have been a number of twists and turns in this case, and the reason I first learned about it is because the story has a connection to a very controversial segment which was once featured on Unsolved Mysteries, but we'll go into more details about that a little later. At the time of this recording, we are only a few weeks away from the 40th anniversary of Sharita's disappearance, so I thought it would be a good time to cover it on this episode. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved disappearance of Sharita Thomas. Our story begins in Michigan in 1980. Our central figure is a 20-year-old African-American woman named Sharita Thomas, who is currently living in an apartment in the town of Oscoda with her 4-year-old daughter, as well as her fiancé, William Merritt, who is enlisted in the Air Force. One of Sharita's best friends is a woman named Patricia Bates, who happens to be her neighbor at their apartment building. On Sunday, August the 3rd, Patricia was planning to travel to the nearby town of Mankato to see her friend play in a softball tournament, and Sharita wanted to go with her, so they made arrangements for Patricia's sister, Anna Bouchard, to babysit their kids. The two women, along with Sharita's daughter and Patricia's 2 children, climbed into Patricia's car, an AMC Matador, and traveled to Unsolved Township to drop off the children with Anna. They stopped off at Wurtsmith Air Force Base so Sharita could borrow some money from her fiancé William before driving to the Hilltop Bar in Oscoda for a drink. While there, they briefly ran into 28-year-old Jimmy Allen Nelson, who happened to be Anna's brother-in-law, before they left to travel to Mankato for the softball tournament. After finding out that Patricia's friend was not actually playing in the game that was scheduled, the two women decided to grab something to eat at the Mankato Tavern. While they were there, Patricia recalled that many of the patrons stared at them and made them feel so uncomfortable that both she and Sharita stepped into the ladies' room together for a moment in order to chat. When they walked out, one of the patrons shouted out, quote, "Did you two have a good time in there?" This prompted Sharita and Patricia to leave the tavern, and while they were doing so, the bartender told them not to come back. They finally went to see the softball tournament, and after it concluded, the team that Patricia's friend played on went to the Mankato Tavern for drinks, and in spite of the uncomfortable situation from earlier, Sharita and Patricia accompanied them. However, Sharita wanted to leave so she could be back home before her fiancé returned from work. Since Patricia wanted to stay out later, she agreed to let Sharita borrow her car and drive home on her own. She also drew up a map to Anna's place in Unsolved Township so that Sharita could drive there and pick up the children, before returning to their apartment building in Oscoda. Sharita left Mikado and Patricia's Matador, and after spending a couple more hours at the tavern, Patricia returned to her apartment at around 2:30 a.m. However, she was surprised to discover that the Matador was not parked there, and after phoning Anna, she learned that Sharita had never shown up to pick up the children. Patricia then spoke to Sharita's fiancé, William, at their apartment, who told her that Sharita had not yet arrived, and he had no idea where she was. They subsequently contacted the Oscoda Township Police Department to report Sharita missing, but it wasn't long before they informed Patricia that her abandoned Matador had been discovered on Sunset Street in Unsolved Township, only 2 blocks away from Anna's residence. There was no trace of Sharita, and even though the vehicle's keys were missing, Sharita's apartment keys, cigarettes, and the map to Anna's place Patricia had drawn were still inside. The Matador had broken down because of a leaky radiator, and it wasn't long before police were able to retrace the steps to figure out how the car got there. The previous evening, Sharita had been traveling through Oscoda when steam started leaking from the Matador's hood, and it broke down at an intersection. A trio of teenage boys stopped to help her and discovered the leak in the radiator, so they refilled it with water and put some duct tape over the hose as a temporary solution. While this was going on, the teens claimed that a man driving a blue pickup truck passed by and gave them an obscene gesture. Sharita got back into the Matador and drove away, but the radiator evidently broke down again when she was driving down Sunset Street in Osable Township. An eyewitness would claim he saw steam leaking from the hood while Sharita walked down the street away from the vehicle. However, she returned to the scene a short time later in a blue Ford pickup truck being driven by a white male. Another eyewitness would later say they thought they might have seen a third person inside the truck, but could not be sure. After making an unsuccessful attempt to start the Matador again, Sharita and the man climbed back into the truck before it drove away at around 11:15 p.m. And unfortunately, this would turn out to be the last time Sharita was confirmed to be alive. A search effort was launched for Sharita, but it wasn't long before investigators focused on a potential suspect, Anna Bouchard's brother-in-law, Jimmy Allen Nelson. As you recall, Sharita and Patricia had briefly bumped into Jimmy at the Hilltop Bar several hours before Sharita vanished. While Jimmy participated in the initial search effort for her, he first drew the attention of investigators 1 week after Sharita went missing, when a woman came forward and accused Jimmy of sexually molesting her, and also said that he was a violent racist. Indeed, a number of other people would back the allegations that Jimmy often expressed his dislike for African-American people, including the bartender at the Hilltop, who claimed that Jimmy freely used the N-word, and once told her, quote, "The only good N-word is a dead one." In fact, according to Anna Bouchard, Jimmy had once gotten angry with her for allowing Sharita into her home because she was black. Jimmy also happened to live on Sunset Street with his wife and children, not too far from where the Matador broke down, and he also drove a blue pickup truck. This made police wonder if Sharita's disappearance might have been a racially motivated hate crime, as she lived in what was a predominantly white, conservative area. Since the case was looked at as a potential hate crime, the FBI would be brought in to assist with the investigation. When Jimmy was questioned, he did admit to owning 2 pickup trucks, one of which was a blue Ford brand, while the other was red and orange, but he said his wife was borrowing the blue one at that time. In the end, police never did get a chance to search Jimmy's blue pickup truck because their investigation soon turned towards another promising suspect. On August the 13th, a man named Grant Goddard broke into a wealthy family's vacation residence in Alcona County, Michigan, alongside his son Kenneth, in order to perform a burglary. However, they crossed paths with the property's caretaker, George Wismiller, and wound up fatally shooting him, and while Kenneth Goddard was eventually convicted of Wismiller's murder, father and son would accuse each other of pulling the trigger. At the time, Grant Goddard was already a wanted fugitive on federal charges, and investigators would look into some possible links with Sharita's case. Goddard could be placed in the area around the approximate time period Sharita went missing. He owned a blue pickup truck, and he seemed to have a stronger resemblance to the unidentified white male driver than Jimmy Nelson. Months later, Goddard's truck was found abandoned and stripped down in a national forest near Oscoda. And when Kenneth Goddard was charged with George Wismiller's murder, he told investigators that his father was involved in Sharita's disappearance. Well, Grant Goddard was eventually captured and sent to prison, but it was not until 1993 when the FBI formally interviewed him about his potential role in Sharita's case. While Goddard initially said that someone else had once asked him to assist in the disposal of a black woman, he later admitted he was lying because he hoped investigators would take him out of prison to help search for her body, giving him a potential chance to escape. In addition, Goddard's son also confessed that he had lied about his father being responsible for Sharita's disappearance because he wanted to get revenge for his father's decision to testify against him when he went on trial for Wismiller's murder. A more thorough investigation eventually determined that Goddard had an alibi on the night Sharita went missing, so he was ruled out as a suspect in her case. This prompted investigators to take a fresh look at Jimmy Nelson, who had since moved to Houston, Texas, and he would be interviewed several times by both the police and the FBI over a period of 2 decades. However, during these interviews, Nelson provided so many conflicting statements and inconsistencies in his stories that the authorities became convinced he was involved. At one point, he claimed to have not even known Sharita at all, even though he had been seen at the Hilltop Bar with her and Patricia Bates on the day she went missing. During an interview with the FBI in March of 2001, Nelson suddenly told them a completely new story, claiming that he had just seen a hypnotist, causing his memory to improve. He now admitted that he was the driver of the blue pickup truck seen giving Sharita a ride before she disappeared. Jimmy said he had been at the Hilltop Bar that night when Sharita arrived and told him that Patricia's Matador had broken down on Sunset Street, so he gave her a ride there. When they failed to get the car started, he drove Sharita to her apartment so she could pick up her keys and purse, and at her request, he then drove her to an establishment called Wiltz's Restaurant. After dropping her off there sometime after 11:15 p.m., Jimmy said he never saw Sharita again, and claimed that he never told anybody about this earlier because Sharita asked him not to. However, there were a number of holes in Jimmy's story. The investigating agent spoke to the owner of Wiltz's Restaurant, who informed them that the establishment would not have been open after 11:15 p.m. When confronted with this, Jimmy said that even though the restaurant was closed, there were still employees inside who were cleaning, and he saw them let Sharita inside. But once again, the restaurant's owner disputed this, maintaining that they always closed at 8 p.m. on Sundays, and that it only would have taken the staff around 45 to 90 minutes to clean before they left. Jimmy then responded by saying that his memory was faulty, and he could not actually remember where he dropped Sharita off that night. Another major hole in Jimmy's story was his claim that he stopped by Sharita's apartment so she could pick up her purse. However, when Sharita's fiancé, William Merritt, arrived home that night, he maintained that Sharita's purse was there. And since Sharita's apartment keys were found inside the Matador, how could she have gotten inside to begin with? Investigators would also speak to numerous witnesses who claimed that Jimmy had asked them to lie to the authorities in order to back up his story, but they refused to do so. For example, when Jimmy frequented the Hilltop Bar on the evening of August the 3rd, the bartender was certain that Jimmy drove his blue pickup truck there, but he allegedly kept pushing her to say that he had actually driven his red and orange truck. According to the bartender, she never saw Jimmy drive his blue pickup at all following Sharita's disappearance, as he apparently kept it in his backyard, surrounded by 2 or 3 feet of firewood, before selling it sometime during the 1990s, and he once told her that the police would need a warrant if they wanted to search it. In addition, the bartender said that Jimmy seemed to mellow out with his racist attitudes after Sharita went missing and started talking to more black people. The authorities also became interested in a deer hunting camp Jimmy had owned, which was located in Huron National Forest on the edge of Oscoda. Since Jimmy just seemed to abandon the camp and stop using it after Sharita vanished, they decided to perform a search of the property, which would lead to another surprising development. Now, remember how I mentioned during the intro that this case had a connection to a controversial story from Unsolved Mysteries? Well, in 2001, the show produced a segment about a dog handler named Sandra Anderson and her Doberman pinscher, Eagle. Anderson's job involved training dogs for search and rescue work, and Eagle was a cadaver dog with an amazing sense of smell who supposedly had a special ability to sniff out human remains. There were already several documented cases of Eagle uncovering bones which had been buried at hard-to-find locations, so in April of 2002, the FBI and the Oscoda Township Police Department decided to enlist Anderson's services so that Eagle could perform a search of Nelson's deer hunting camp in Huron National Forest. Well, sure enough, on the second day of the search, Eagle uncovered some human remains, and everyone momentarily believed that Sharita had finally been found. But there was one problem. Sandra Anderson turned out to be a complete and utter fraud. You see, whenever Eagle dug up human remains during search efforts for missing persons, DNA testing would often reveal that the bones did not match the victims. On the day Sharita's remains were supposedly found, an Oscoda police officer named Mark David was bothered by an incident where Anderson searched a creek and found what appeared to be a knucklebone. Well, David had searched that same creek only moments earlier and found nothing, and also thought he had seen Anderson putting one hand behind her foot before she uncovered the knucklebone. The following day, David voiced his concerns with a lab technician who decided to keep a close eye on Anderson, and it wasn't long before the technician caught Anderson pulling a bone out of her boot and placing it in a creek. Anderson was subsequently arrested by the FBI, and a search of her home turned up a number of human bones which she had stolen from a medical examiner's office. And as you probably guessed, DNA testing would reveal that none of the bones found during the search of the deer hunting camp belonged to Sharita Thomas, as they had been planted there by Anderson. She subsequently pled guilty to planting evidence and making false statements, and received a 21-month prison sentence. So if you've never seen the Unsolved Mysteries segment I was referring to, there's a good reason for that, as they elected not to air it again following Anderson's arrest, and you will not find it on Amazon Prime or YouTube. Anyway, in spite of the setback, investigators did not take their focus off Jimmy Nelson and gradually build up a case against him. The Iosco County Prosecuting Attorney's Office reviewed all the interviews Nelson gave to law enforcement over the years, and since 2 of the interviews had been conducted while he was under oath, the authorities believed there was enough conflicting statements and proven lies to press charges. In April of 2004, Nelson was arrested in Houston and formally charged with multiple counts of perjury, as well as 1 count of obstruction of justice. After he was extradited to Michigan, Nelson was released on an electronic tether to await trial, which meant he could not leave the state, so he stayed at his son's house in Osable Township. Well, even though Sharita's body could still not be found, the Iosco County Prosecuting Attorney's Office believed they had a strong enough case against Nelson to take him to trial for killing her, so on December the 28th, he was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, as well as additional counts of perjury, making it 22 perjury counts against him in total. In October of 2005, a preliminary examination would be held in front of Iosco County Circuit Court Judge Richard E. Noble in order to determine if Nelson should stand trial for murder. A total of 15 witnesses were called upon to testify about the conflicting statements and inconsistencies from Nelson's interviews, but his defense attorneys argued that these were simply the result of a bad memory which had been caused by years of alcoholism. Since Jimmy had been interviewed several times by many different investigators over a 21-year period, his defense team believed he was very suggestible, and that since he did not have a clear memory of what happened at the time Sharita went missing, Jimmy was simply repeating what other people had told him over the years, which is what caused the inconsistencies in his stories. Well, Judge Noble ultimately believed that there was just not enough evidence to conclusively prove that Jimmy killed Sharita, so the second-degree murder charge was dismissed, as well as 9 of the perjury charges against him. In spite of this, Jimmy would have to stand trial for the remaining counts of perjury, as well as the obstruction of justice charge, and if convicted on all counts, he could potentially face a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. The trial took place in October of 2006, and in the end, the jury found Nelson guilty on 5 counts of perjury and 1 count of obstruction of justice, but acquitted him of the 8 remaining perjury charges. Nelson received a sentence of 2 years, but since he had already been incarcerated in jail for nearly 2 years while awaiting trial, Nelson was given credit for time served and released less than 1 month after the guilty verdict. In the meantime, a lot of legal wrangling had been taking place as the Iosco County Prosecuting Attorney's Office appealed Judge Noble's ruling that there was insufficient evidence to charge Nelson with murder. The Michigan Court of Appeals eventually granted their appeal and sent the case back to Iosco County Circuit Court. This time, it would be heard in front of a different circuit court judge, and in April of 2009, he ruled that Jimmy was to stand trial for second-degree murder. The defense requested a bench trial, meaning that the case would be heard in front of Iosco County Circuit Court Judge William F. Miles rather than a jury. The trial began in October of 2010, and the brunt of the prosecution's case against Nelson would be his own conflicting statements during interviews, as well as the testimony from the 2 eyewitnesses who saw Sharita climb into a blue pickup truck resembling Nelson's truck right before she vanished. The trial only lasted 2 days, but Judge Miles ultimately believed that the evidence was strong enough for a conviction, so he found Nelson guilty of second-degree murder and gave him a sentence of 25 to 50 years in prison. But of course, the story would not end there. Nelson's defense team appealed his conviction to the Michigan Court of Appeals, and in August of 2012, a 3-judge panel ruled to overturn it. They believed that the evidence was insufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Nelson had murdered Sharita Thomas, stating that, quote, "Speculation is not a sufficient basis upon which to convict an accused under our system of justice," end quote. Well, over the next year and a half, there would be a lot more legal wrangling, as the Michigan Supreme Court would eventually issue an order reversing the Court of Appeals decision and remanding the case back to them for, quote-unquote, consideration of the defendant's remaining issues. While the legal wrangling continued, Nelson was released on bond, but on February the 24th, 2014, the Court of Appeals once again ruled to vacate his conviction, but this time, they did so at the surprising request of Iosco County prosecutor Nicole Palumbo, who decided to dismiss the murder charge against Nelson 2 weeks later. This decision was made on the basis of newly discovered evidence, and according to the Court of Appeals' ruling, quote, "To protect the confidential nature of this evidence, we note only that the evidence implicates another person as the perpetrator of Thomas's death," end quote. So yes, apparently, new evidence was found to indicate that someone else besides Jimmy Nelson was responsible for murdering Sharita, but specific details about this evidence, as well as the identity of this other person, have remained sealed from the public for the past 6 years. While Jimmy is now a free man again, no one else has ever been charged with their role in Sharita's disappearance, and she continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, I would like to take a few moments to tell you about a podcast titled Infamous America, which covers historical true crime. Hosted by Chris Wimmer, the man you heard narrating the opening of today's episode, this podcast takes you on a journey through the wildest and darkest chapters of American history, from the Salem witch trials, to the gangsters of the 1930s, to Alcatraz, to the Black Sox scandal from the 1919 World Series, which as a baseball fan, is a story I'm particularly obsessed with. Each season of the show takes a deep dive into an infamous person or event in American history, and this month, July of 2020, they've just launched their newest season, covering a story that I'm sure virtually all of you are familiar with. This season is the big one, as it features what is the only unsolved airplane hijacking in American history and one of the most famous unsolved mysteries of all time. That's right, it's the story of the one and only D.B. Cooper. If you're listening to The Trail Went Cold, then I'm sure you know who that is, and Infamous America is providing an all-new, in-depth look into this case, and it's available for your listening pleasure right now. So be sure to subscribe to Infamous America on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. Now, this is a crazy case which contains so many bizarre twists and turns that it practically became a circus at times, but the most tragic element is that the victim, Sharita Thomas, has almost been overlooked. There really isn't a whole lot of information out there about Sharita as a person, other than the fact that she had a fiancé and young daughter. Given that Sharita was only 20 years old and had a daughter who was 4, she obviously had her child at a very young age, but not much is known about her background. I know that her fiancé, William Merritt, went on to raise Sharita's daughter after she went missing, but it's still not even 100% clear to me if William was the biological father. And the only photograph I could find of Sharita online was a very small, blurry one, and it always saddens me when I research older missing persons cases and there are so few available pictures of the victim. As the years went on, it seems like the story became more about Sharita's alleged killer, Jimmy Allen Nelson, and whether or not he was actually guilty of the crime. Now truthfully, under normal circumstances, I would be inclined to believe that Jimmy was responsible for Sharita's disappearance, as his constantly changing stories are a huge red flag. But at the same time, I can't really dispute the numerous decisions which have been made to dismiss or overturn murder charges against him, because technically, there is no direct evidence that a crime was even committed here. Quite frankly, I am a bit surprised that Jimmy was even convicted of second-degree murder, because his defense team had requested a bench trial rather than a jury trial. On one hand, asking for a bench trial can be a huge risk, because if the judge comes back with a guilty verdict, it can be a major uphill battle getting an appeals court to undermine a judge's decision by overturning the conviction. But on the other hand, if the prosecution's case is not all that strong, then a bench trial might be the best option. While a jury can sometimes let their emotions and gut feelings influence their verdict and convict a defendant just because they think they look guilty, a judge is going to weigh the facts and the evidence and look at everything objectively. It appears that even without a body or any physical evidence, Judge William F. Miles still believed the case against Nelson was strong enough to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but obviously, the Michigan Court of Appeals disagreed. But of course, the revelation that newly discovered evidence now points to another person being responsible has thrown everything for a loop. Like I mentioned earlier, even if I did not believe the evidence against Nelson was strong enough to convict him of murder, I still would have leaned towards him being guilty were it not for that statement about the newly discovered evidence. Unfortunately, since this evidence has been sealed from the public, there's not much I can really say about it, but it was apparently compelling enough that even the Iosco County prosecutor requested that the Court of Appeals vacate Nelson's conviction, which is pretty out of the ordinary. Whenever a conviction is overturned, the state will often keep up the facade that the defendant is still guilty unless there's some very conclusive exculpatory evidence, such as DNA testing. Here, it sounds like new evidence pointing to another individual was strong enough to convince the state that Nelson was innocent, but at the same time, it has not led to this other suspect being charged with the crime. However, let's start from the very beginning. Even if Jimmy Nelson was actually innocent of this crime, it does not sound like he was a very nice man, as numerous witnesses have reported him exhibiting racist behavior, which is why it was compelling to believe that Sharita's disappearance might have been a hate crime. In fact, even if Jimmy himself wasn't responsible, it's possible that racism still could have been the primary motive for what happened to her. After all, she was an African-American woman living in a predominantly white community, and even though it might not have any connection to her disappearance at all, I think it's important to talk about the uncomfortable incident when Sharita and Patricia went to grab something to eat at the Mikado Tavern. As you recall, Patricia claimed that the patrons kept staring at them and made them feel uncomfortable, and when they left, the bartender told them not to come back. It's not clear why everyone in the bar acted this way, but I'm willing to infer that perhaps they were not too happy about having a black woman inside their establishment. And since one of the patrons harassed the two women for going into the ladies' room together, they may have had an issue with their interracial friendship. In spite of this, Sharita and Patricia returned to the tavern later that night, but that might have been because Patricia's friend and their entire softball team was with them, which made them feel safer. But I get the impression that Sharita was still uncomfortable to be back there, which might have inspired her decision to borrow Patricia's car and drive home by herself. If that's the case, then this adds an extra element of tragedy to the story, because if Sharita and Patricia had driven home together, things might have turned out differently. Not that I'm blaming Patricia for what happened, but this entire episode at the tavern does shed some light on why Sharita decided to leave on her own. Anyway, it seems pretty obvious that after Patricia's Matador broke down on Sunset Street in Osable Township, Sharita was subsequently abducted and murdered by the unidentified man driving the blue Ford pickup truck, but the unanswered question is whether or not this man was Jimmy Nelson. We do know that Jimmy also lived on Sunset Street during that time period, so he definitely would have had the opportunity if he was in the area that night. However, it's worth noting that when the Matador previously broke down in Oscoda, the teenage boys who stopped to tape up the radiator claimed they saw a man drive by in a blue pickup truck and give them an obscene gesture. So could this have been the same driver who picked up Sharita? Well, Oscoda is about 4 miles from Osable Township, so if the driver set their sights on Sharita at that moment, they would have had to follow her until the Matador broke down again on Sunset Street. I know that Jimmy told many different conflicting stories about his whereabouts that night, but he did often place himself at the Hilltop Bar, so he very well could have been in Oscoda when Sharita first developed car trouble. We have at least 2 eyewitnesses who saw Sharita with the white male in the pickup truck on Sunset Street, and one of them said it looked like the man and woman knew each other, which is why you could infer he was Jimmy. Now, one of the constantly changing stories Jimmy shared while he was being interviewed by law enforcement is that he was drinking at the Hilltop Bar when Sharita showed up to inform him about her car trouble, so he drove her to the stalled vehicle. However, the timeline really doesn't match up here. According to one of the eyewitnesses from Sunset Street, Sharita walked away from the Matador and returned a short time later in the pickup truck. While it's unclear how much exact time passed, like I just mentioned, Oscoda is about 4 miles from Unsolved Township, and there's no way Sharita walked that entire distance on foot to the Hilltop Bar. Whoever the driver of that pickup truck was, it's clear they were already in Unsolved Township near Sunset Street when the Matador broke down. Now, the reason Jimmy first popped up on the radar as a potential suspect because another woman went to the police and accused him of sexually molesting her. I've been unable to find out how that particular episode turned out, but I'm guessing he was never charged with the sexual assault. The main reason investigators stopped focusing on Jimmy as a suspect for a while was because they started looking into Grant Goddard, who was already a federal fugitive and involved in another murder at that time. There were compelling reasons to suspect him, as he could be placed in the area around the time Sharita went missing, he drove a blue pickup truck around that time period, which was later found stripped and abandoned, and he apparently bore a closer resemblance to the unidentified pickup driver than Jimmy Nelson did. In the end, the FBI ultimately eliminated Goddard as a suspect because he had an alibi, but unfortunately, there are no specific details about this alibi, only that it was apparently strong enough to rule him out. Ordinarily, I would have probably just taken their word for it and believed Goddard was not involved, but the fact that this newly discovered evidence pointed towards another person besides Nelson has made me do a double take. Could investigators have missed something about Goddard the first time around, and now believe he was the most likely perpetrator? Well, there are many good reasons to withhold the name of this individual from the public, but Goddard is a convicted felon, and was already named as a potential suspect in the past, so I am inclined to believe that this person is someone whose name has never been mentioned before. Of course, the other big complication in this case were the fraudulent practices of Sandra Anderson, who attempted to plant human remains at Jimmy Nelson's deer hunting camp for her cadaver-sniffing dog Eagle to find. And unfortunately, for a day or two, she gave the investigators and Sharita's loved ones the false hope that her remains had finally been found. I would really love to go on a lengthy rant against Sandra Anderson, but I don't want to get too sidetracked from this story. However, it should be mentioned that Anderson was discovered to have planted human bones during search efforts in a number of different cases, so I wouldn't say she did it here because she had a personal attachment to Sharita's case and wanted to frame Jimmy Nelson. Anderson just did it because she was likely a very disturbed person who loved the attention, and Sharita's case just happened to be the first time she got caught in the act. But man, imagine how things might have played out if Anderson had not been caught. If this had led to Nelson being arrested, the investigation might have been damaged beyond all repair. Even if DNA testing came back and revealed that the bones found at the deer hunting camp did not belong to Sharita, they still had to belong to someone, so Jimmy may have been suspected of being a deranged serial killer who buried his victims' remains all over his property. During the aforementioned Unsolved Mystery segment they produced about Anderson, they had a section devoted to a victim named Tracy Islam, who was murdered by her husband, Dr. Azizul Islam. During a search of the doctor's basement, Eagle used his skills to pick up the victim's scent, which gave police probable cause to obtain a search warrant to dig up her basement. They found traces of the victim's blood, which led to Dr. Islam being arrested and convicted of his wife's murder. Well, even though Islam was definitely guilty of the crime, his defense team used the new revelations about Anderson as grounds to file an appeal and alleged that Anderson planted the blood in his basement in order to frame him. Since there was other corroborating evidence against Islam, the conviction was upheld, but this just demonstrated how every single case that Anderson worked on wound up being tainted and had to be re-examined. So it's a good thing they caught Anderson planting the remains at the deer hunting camp, because otherwise, her actions could have tainted the investigation so badly and rendered Sharita's case completely unsolvable. All that being said, it's possible this case might be unsolvable anyway, regardless of whether or not Jimmy Nelson actually did it. The false lead involving Grant Goddard might have had a negative impact on the investigation because the authorities didn't put their focus back onto Jimmy until over a decade passed after Sharita originally went missing. The fact that Jimmy changed his story so many times while being interviewed by law enforcement might seem pretty damning on the surface, but you cannot forget that most of these interviews took place years after the fact when his memory was not fresh. By his own admission, he was a heavy drinker who had serious issues with alcoholism, and during his trials, his defense team argued that these issues made it very difficult for him to accurately recall anything from 2 decades earlier. They maintained that Jimmy was very suggestible, and that he may have admitted to doing things he didn't actually do because other people told him he had done them. Whenever he shared stories which were proven to be false, such as him dropping Sharita off at a restaurant hours after it would have been closed, he may have thought these events took place, when in actuality, he has no memory at all of anything that happened on August 3rd, 1980. His defense team did have a valid point, as investigators did sometimes manipulate Jimmy into saying things which weren't true. For instance, at one point, the FBI told Jimmy that his fingerprints had been found in the abandoned Matador, which caused him to doubt his own story and come up with an explanation for it, when in actuality, the FBI was lying and his fingerprints were not found at all. We also cannot forget that in addition to the second-degree murder charge, Jimmy was also charged with 22 counts of perjury and 1 count of obstruction of justice. This adds additional confusion to the case, because 9 of those perjury counts were dismissed by a circuit court judge before Jimmy even went on trial, and when the trial finally happened, a jury found Jimmy guilty of obstruction of justice and on 5 of the perjury counts, but they acquitted him on the remaining 8 perjury charges. Unfortunately, I'm not privy to the specific details of each of these perjury counts, so I have no idea what compelled the jury to reach this verdict, but the impression seems to be that they thought Jimmy had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be lying on some things, but not others. But how do you make the distinction between a person who's intentionally lying or a person who's simply getting things wrong because of a faulty memory? I mean, it would be one thing if there was other corroborating evidence against Jimmy besides his conflicting statements and testimony from other eyewitnesses who claimed that he lied, but that was pretty much the crux of the entire case against him at his murder trial. When you have a hard enough time getting a conviction on most of the perjury charges against him, how do you prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed someone? There was no body, no physical evidence, and while there were eyewitnesses who saw Sharita climbing into a blue pickup truck with a white male, it does not sound like they were able to positively identify this guy as Jimmy. And even if Jimmy was the white male who picked up Sharita, that does not prove he killed her. I guess there's also a matter of whether or not Sharita would have willingly climbed inside a truck with him to begin with. The first time the Matador broke down that night, the 3 teenagers who pulled over to help Sharita claimed that she refused their offer to give her a ride, which is why they attempted to tape up the radiator instead. So if she didn't want to accept a ride with them, why did she accept a ride with the pickup truck driver? After all, she was only 2 blocks away from Anna Bouchard's house, so she could have just walked the rest of the way there to call for help. Since she ran into Jimmy at the Hilltop Bar earlier that day, Sharita obviously knew him personally, and he was Anna's brother-in-law, so that might explain why she was willing to hitch a ride with him. On the other hand, Jimmy did have a reputation for being a racist, but perhaps Sharita had never seen that side of him and did not know that at the time. But if Jimmy wanted to commit a hate crime, having an African-American woman climb into his truck would have been the perfect opportunity. Once again, on the surface, all signs do point to Jimmy being the most likely perpetrator, yet they apparently found new evidence pointing to someone else. So who could this other person be? Well, during the original investigation, police apparently looked into a sex offender living in the area who also drove a blue pickup truck, though there's no further information available about him. It is possible that Sharita was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time and accepted a ride from a random predator. Also, one of the eyewitnesses thought they might have seen an additional person inside the truck when Sharita was picked up, so it's possible that 2 people might have been involved. I'm sure the authorities have their reasons for keeping the identity of the alternate suspect and the evidence against them sealed, but the murder charge against Jimmy was officially dismissed in 2014, and as far as I can tell, there hasn't been any further movement on this case at all during the past 6 years. Unless some additional information comes out about the alternate suspect, this case might be destined to remain an unsolved mystery. It's possible the suspect might already be dead by now or incarcerated for another crime, but the evidence against them isn't strong enough to publicly reveal their name. Whatever the case, this whole thing is a major tragedy, because not only have Sharita's family not received any justice, but they have still never recovered her body. So if you happen to have any information on the unsolved disappearance of Sharita Thomas, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Anyway, another special thanks to Chris Wimmer for doing such a great job at narrating our opening, and I highly recommend you check out his podcast, Infamous America, which has released an all-new season about D.B. Cooper this month. Also, another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released an episode on a final appeal case from Unsolved Mysteries about the controversial conviction of Steve Shores, a young resident from Chicago's South Side who served time in prison for the murder of a security guard, but maintained that he was framed by the real killers. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Marianne B, Heather B, Carrie K, Danny, and Robert S. Thank you all so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I have another important announcement. You might recall that last month, I announced I was going to be participating in an all-day podcast-a-thon on the streaming platform Get Vocal, in which a number of prominent podcasters, including myself, would host their own individual live stream sessions in order to raise money for Tawny Plattis, a fellow podcaster who tragically lost her husband last year. Well, unfortunately, we had to temporarily postpone it, but I'm happy to announce that it's finally been rescheduled to this coming Saturday, July the 11th, and will run from 10 a.m. until 10 p.m. Pacific Time, which for those of you like me on the East Coast means that it will run from 1 p.m. until 1 a.m. Eastern Time. My particular live stream session will take place at the end of the evening at 9:15 p.m. Pacific Time, aka 12:15 a.m. Eastern Time, and will be titled Robin Reads Ridiculous Reviews, as I share some of the most absurd podcast reviews The Trail Went Cold has ever received. A raffle will also be held in which we will be giving away Trail Went Cold merchandise. Anyway, here's a promo with more information, and I will also be providing this info in our show notes. Have a listen, and I hope to see you this Saturday.
We have all experienced loss or know someone who has. Unfortunately, some can relate to losing a spouse with chronic health concerns. On November 8, 2019, George Plattis, one half of the dynamic duo of the Dirty Bits podcast, lost his battle with multiple illnesses. His widow, Tawny, now must pick up the pieces left behind. Join us on Saturday, June 6, on the Get Vocal platform as various podcasters host a podcast-a-thon to support Tawny and the expenses she's incurred as a result of her loss. Let's show her what this community is made of. As a participant, you will have the opportunity to bid on merch packs and even a private Zoom call with some of your favorite podcasters. Best of all, you get to help someone in need. We hope we can count on you to be there. A link for the GoFundMe and more information about the podcast-a-thon will be found in the show notes below.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.